you're attending Climate Change, Impact on Bees and Other Pollinators, Agriculture, and its Impact on Humanity with Mel Gadd. Mel has been keeping bees in traditional and non-traditional hives at school and at community gardens in Mass Audubon Drumlin Farm and Wildlife Sanctuary for over 16 years. He has been a member of the Essex County Beekeepers Association, chair of the Essex County Beekeepers Association Bee School, and on the board of directors of the Boston Area Beekeepers Association, and was named the Beekeeper of the Year in 2017 by the Massachusetts Beekeepers Association. I want to say welcome, and we're happy to have you all on our call. Before we jump in, I have a few details to review with you. First are our equity slides. NOFAMAS is strengthening our commitment to racial equity and justice by examining whiteness and dismantling systems of white supremacy that are part of many dominant systems, including our agriculture and food systems. We also want to honor the Indigenous land stewards who are the original occupants of the land that we are currently living, farming, and residing. Please use this link and find the area you farm and live and identify the original steward of those lands. Lastly, we want to call on everyone, especially white allies and co-conspirators, to action on a few items to assist BIPOC-led organizations. These actions are listed on this slide. Also, there are 2 events taking place for Spanish speakers and for BIPOC members. Please take a moment to review the slide. Session etiquette and info. We will make every effort to get questions you've answered during the workshop. Please feel free to use the chat feature to comment or ask questions during the workshop, and we will pose your questions to the presenter throughout the session. We will try to find some time at the end for you to go off mute and ask your questions live. Please note that this session is being recorded. If you feel comfortable having your camera on, please keep it on during the session, but remember to keep your microphone on mute. To speak at the end of the session, simply click the microphone icon at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to save your chat at the end of this session, to the right of the chat box, there are 3 dots with extra actions. Click the 3 dots and select Save Chat, and it will download to your computer, probably into your download file. Please reference the workshop materials folders for some useful handouts that Mel provided as a supplement to his workshop today. We have a number of sponsors who will help make our conference possible, and I encourage you to purchase from them, and when you do, let them know you appreciate their support of NOFAMAS. We've got some incredible items to bid on in our online auction. Visit http://go.rallyup.com/winter auction or text NOFA to 855-202-2100 to see the lineup. Please also take a moment to explore the virtual vendor marketplace, where there is a lot of great information and some generous discount codes for conference attendees. Most importantly, we want to thank you. Thank you for spending the weekend with us, and especially to our NOFA members who make your education and advocacy work possible. And now, at this point, I will turn it over to Mel for his presentation. Thank you, Mel.
Okay. So hopefully everybody can see my first slide. As Christina said, I've been keeping bees for about 16 years, and I've been running a major beekeeping program for Mass Audubon out at their Drumlin Farm facility in Lincoln, Mass for the past, I believe, 6 years. And so a lot of the work I do out there, there's a case study as part of this talk that will talk about that and the impact that has had on the farm itself. Originally, Drumlin had 2 hives that a gentleman used to run. And since then, I started the major program where at this point, we now have approximately 18 beehives spread out among the whole property, which is about 250 acres. People are welcome to ask questions as I'm going through. If something comes up, I find that it's easier to reference what you're asking about at that point instead of waiting till the end. Or if you want to wait till the end, you're welcome to. Okay. So let me get started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and the impact on the bees, pollinators, agriculture, and humanity. And then I'm going to do a little bit talk about beekeeping, encouraging small-scale organic farms to start beekeeping programs, and for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about. So there are a lot of pictures throughout the talk that I'll explain that kind of show you a bit about Drumlin Farm. So this is just the description that was in the workshop handbook. So I'm just going to skip over that. So I'm going to talk about climate change and the impact it has on the honeybees and us, and on agricultural production, impact on our food supplies in the US and worldwide. If anybody watched some of the news reports in the last few days, you can see the impact that climate change is drastically having on some of the African countries, where there have been major droughts, and the impact on the animals, no less on people. And it's just going to continue to get worse until we do something about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what climate change is and its impact, and the beneficiaries of honeybees, pollinators, and beekeepers, and why they're important to us. And then about our experience at Drumlin with respect to climate change. And then a primer on how to start a beekeeping program at small scale farms or in your backyard. It really doesn't, the location doesn't really matter. And what the costs are and what the financial impact is for you. Okay, so I always start my talks with a little musical interlude. I'll preface this by saying this person is not me, but it's kind of try to get you in the mood. So here we go.
Sing a song of the bees, thousand as one, led by a queen. Bees by the thousand, they are working together, bringing nectar and pollen. Whatever the weather, I gotta keep the queen fed, laying 2 eggs a minute. For the next generation, the sky's the limit. Oh, evolution we see. Flowers and bees, nectar for fertile seeds. We pop off the top to inspect the brood. White larvae and eggs mean that things are all good. We try to avoid the end with the stinger, but every now and then we still get stung on the finger, stung on the finger. Put some ice on that sting, cool down the bird, easing the suffering. Got Varroa and Nosema and no tracheal mites. It's a mess with all these pests, we might just give up the fight. But no disease will kill my bees, cause I take care of my hive. And through the winter into April, they will still be alive. Still be alive, my bees are alive. Summer the pollen and the honey like a feast, and then in August we'll collect it and we'll have a great feast with lots of meat and pie and honeycomb and cookies too. And we'll still have enough to give honey to you, honey to you. song of the bees, thousands as one, led by a queen. Co-evolution we see, flowers and bees, nectar for fertile seeds.
So hopefully this little tune has gotten you into the mood to talk about honeybees, climate change. I'm not really going to talk a lot about the biology of bees and beekeeping, but the only thing I will point out in this particular picture is that bee that's kind of to the left of center with a yellow dot on her is the queen. There is only one queen in a beehive. If there were more than one, they would find each other and fight to the death. The mark is artificial, and it's placed on her by the beekeeper who has raised her. And it serves two purposes. One, it makes it a little easier to find her, even though she's literally twice the size of the other bees. But it also is color-coded to a year, and it lets the beekeeper know what year she might have been born in. Some beekeepers like to replace their queens every 2 years since they could live up to 5 years. Some of us let the hive replace her when she gets too old to be able to keep the hive going. So often people say to me, well, is that she born with that mark on her? And no, the color is again placed on by the beekeeper. Oops. All right. So climate change is one of the most greatest challenges facing everybody. And it's a broad term that encompasses several variables, including changes in rainfall and daily temperature patterns, increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, heat waves, floods, droughts, as we have seen over the last number of years, even in New England. And these are very disruptive to the natural and managed ecosystems, as well as our farming ability to farm, and fisheries, forest management, and even urban development. The impact of pollinators, and when I talk about pollinators, I'm talking about honeybees, native bees, and all of the other pollinators out there, like birds, other insects, bats. Honeybees are the largest number of pollinators out there. They're the only ones that we, in effect, are able to manage. But there are a lot more pollinators, and all of them are being affected by climate change. This is the value that pollinators create for agriculture in the US, and it's based on a Cornell study that was done a number of years ago. So you can see the impact that pollinators have. And if they disappear, we're going to be kind of in trouble. This little chart kind of shows how what the effects of climate change are. It alters the life pattern of the, and I'll say bees, but I'm really talking about all pollinators. It changes their growth patterns. It also eventually creates more disease. The hotter it is, the warmer the temperatures are, the greater the chance of the insects getting diseases, which are affecting their ability to pollinate our gardens and our farms. So we can see how climate change really will move through all systems and affect everything. I think we all know what's causing it, and we need as humankind to do something to help stop that, which they're trying, and hopefully things will move a little more quickly to get us to the place where we're getting it under control. Otherwise, we're going to be we risk the chance of disappearing. So climate change has created unusual rainfall. This past summer, we had a lot of rainfall in New England, affecting the growing season. Our temperatures were kind of high. And what's interesting is our seasons are stretching. Besides affecting us, it's affecting globally. But one of the things that really has affected us here, well, let me go back, is that our seasons are stretching. So the summer season is starting earlier and ending later. And that has a really negative impact, which I'm going to talk about a little bit related to drumlin, about how that has really affected us. So in parts of China, and I hate to use China as the example, but they have already lost a lot of their pollinators, partially to climate change, partially to pollution, and partially to chemicals. And the way they're doing their pollination is they have people out in the fields doing pollination with little brushes. Now, I can't imagine that ever happening here. We don't have enough people to work on the farms as it is, no less getting enough people to go out there and do hand pollination. So that's, another reason why it's really important for us to change. So timing is everything related to pollination and bees. Pollinators need plants for their nectar and pollen. Their nectar becomes some of their food, and the pollen becomes their food. Plants need pollinators to set the fruit and reproduce. And these relationships have evolved over millions of years, and the timing is very precise. Pollinating insects have been maturing at the exact time that nectar flow begins. And both plants and pollinators depend on climate signals to start these biological responses, like blooming and mating. The timing of these events is called phenology. But not all the species use the same cues. Some rely on temperature, while others use day length. And when these cues that species depend on change, the biological processes that have developed to create this coinciding matching disappears. So if temperature increases from historic norms, which we have seen, I know in Massachusetts, the temperature levels this past year have been higher than any other previous year that they've been keeping temperature records. Day length increases, and that species might emerge at different times. So basically what's happening is a lot of plants are blooming before the pollinators are being born, and so they're missing each other. And so that the levels of pollination are getting lower because of this mismatch. And that's a major problem. This chart basically shows how over the last 10, 20 years, the production of honey has decreased, and the numbers of hives have been decreasing continuously. Now, that's both due to climate change and due to some of the other problems that the bees are having, especially with chemicals that a lot of the farmers are using. Not organic farmers, but a lot of other farmers are using, and even people are using in their yards. And this is weakening the stamina of the bees and other pollinators. The beneficiaries of honeybees and beekeeping and of the other pollinators is how much they contribute to pollination of our crops. Roughly 1/3 of all agricultural crops are pollinated by the bees and other pollinators. and 84% of all cultivated plant species are pollinated. So you can see how important that the bees and pollinators are. They're a unique insect in that they've kept us around for thousands of years, and they have a high economic value for the pollination, which I showed you those charts earlier, and it kind of gets repeated again down below. Honeybees are the chief pollinators within our system, and that's partially because we're able to manage them and hopefully increase the numbers through our management. Honeybees are one of the only pollinators that are able to be managed and in effect raised by beekeepers. A lot of the other pollinators and native bees are not. One of the interesting facts about honeybees that a lot of people don't realize is honeybees are the original immigrants to this country. They were brought over with the pilgrims on the ships from Europe and Africa. But they became the largest number of pollinators as people realized what benefit they had to pollinating the crops out there. So climate change is affecting the bees' behavior, their life cycle, their reproduction rates, and some of their characteristics are kind of decreasing because of climate change. Habitats are kind of disappearing as urban areas have expanded and the availability of forage for the bees and water has disappeared. So we all know that agricultural landscape in this country has decreased considerably, and that again is having a major effect. Some of the problems that the bees and other pollinators are having with respect to parasites and pathogens, as the weather continues to warm, a lot of these issues increase. The warmer it is, the more of these diseases that are spreading and causing problems. And as other landscapes and other sources of food for some of the other predator animals, birds, wasps, whatever, decrease, they're going after the bees. And everybody's heard about African honeybees. They do pollinate, and people do keep Africanized honeybees, especially down south where most of them are at this point. They're just much more aggressive. Now, some of my beekeeping friends think they will not come up here and it won't become a problem up here. Some of us basically disagree with that, saying that they have adapted as they've moved up from South America and that they will adapt to our weather, and our weather's getting warmer anyway. So it's problematic. One of the ways to help the honeybees and the other pollinators is to make more environment available for forage and safe for honeybees. We need to stop some of this deforestation. We need to redevelop some of the forest areas. We need to change the way farmers are farming, especially the big commercial farmers. Monocropping, or as I call it, clear-cut farming, is one of the worst things that happen to the bees and the other pollinators. When the farmers have come in and cleared out everything, weeds, whatever, and plant just one crop. The variety of food available for the bees and other pollinators is gone. And plus, they use so many pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides that it really is harmful to all the bees and other pollinators, and it's having a really negative effect. Now, I know most organic farmers are not doing that, and so we really are encouraging more and more people to either do organic farming or what I call sustainable farming. They may not be certified organic, just as Drumlin is not a certified organic farm, but it is a sustainable farm. They do not use any chemicals. We need to do more research into the biology and genetics of honeybees. We need to start breeding bees, which some people are starting to do now, that are resistant to some of these parasites, pathogens, and predators. We need to increase the nectar and pollen sources, the amount of forage and nutrition out there, and increase the amount of research into techniques and equipment for beekeeping. As everything else in the world is getting to be more digital, there are more digital approaches to doing beekeeping, mostly for monitoring your hives so that you don't have to open them up and check things out. You can do it remotely through digital approaches. And that's a good benefit. We need to raise the awareness of the community. And that's partly for reason for doing this talk, is getting more people involved in beekeeping and understanding honeybees and the beekeeping. We need to get people to diversify how they keep bees. One of the things we do out at Mass Audubon is we do a lot of alternative approaches to beekeeping. There are a lot of different types of beehives. Most people in America use the Langstroth. We do have some Langstroths out at the farm, but we also do a number of different alternatives, which there'll be some slides showing you. Education is a major issue for beekeeping and pollinators and their impact on all of us. Government needs to start doing more policies to protect beekeeping and protecting farms. And there are a lot of things that they can do to help do that, which are spelled out here. This is a bee covered over in pollen. I'd say it's kind of a drunken bee because it's got so much pollen on it. The pollen is mixed with some enzymes and nectar and turns into what we call bee bread. And that becomes the bee's protein source. We need to increase the understanding of farmers about bees and their impact and their ability to increase their output on the farm, which I'm going to talk about our experience at Drumlin. And we need to just get more studies done on how to protect bees and how to increase the effectiveness of how we keep bees. So Mass Audubon's experience and impact of climate change. As everybody knows, the winters have been warmer. Most people like that so that we're not having as much snow. And usually people will say to me, oh, your hives must be doing really well because of the warmer weather. And it's really counterintuitive for us up here. The reality is the reverse is true. The warmer the weather is through the winter, the worse it is for the hives. The bees don't really sleep through the winter. They basically are balled around the queen in the hive and generate temperatures so that she'll start laying her eggs. But the warmer it is, the more they eat. And kind of reverse for us, I think the colder it is, the more we eat, since we think it makes us warmer. And so that it really starts to confuse the bees. And when it's above 45 degrees, we hope for a couple of 45-degree days in the winter. But because the bees then go out of the hive and do bathroom runs. So usually in the winter, you yellow spots all over the snow, which is kind of bee poop. But we only want a couple of those days. Now, last winter or a year ago on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, we had 65-degree weather. And we've had a number of 65-degree days this winter. And the bees get confused. They think it's spring. They will fuel up by eating up some of their honey stores as fuel. And they go flying out looking for flowers and looking for pollen and nectar. And they never make it back because they run out of fuel because there are no flowers at that time of year. So the hives are dying off because the bees are not coming back. So this is a map of Drumlin showing where a lot of our hives are. Again, right now we have 18 hives spread out all over the place. Some beekeepers keep all their hives together. I don't follow that particular approach to beekeeping. I like to spread our hives out so that they're away from each other, so that if there is a disease in one particular hive, it's not as easily spread to adjacent hives since they are spread out. It's also the way the farm is set up that the bees are spread out around the whole farm so that we encourage more pollination. So because of these weather changes, it's forcing us to change how we manage our bees. When I first started beekeeping, we were told to keep 40 to 60 pounds of honey in your hive through the winter to feed the bees. Now, because the winters are warmer and they're eating more, we're now telling people to keep 80 to 100 pounds of honey in the hive. Now, in a standard hive, in a good year, you could get up to 200 or more pounds of honey. So there's just the weather effects of keeping more honey in the hive for them is decreasing the amount of honey that we're able to capture. The other big problem, especially that we have seen out at Drumlin, is normally we used to get a hard frost at least in Massachusetts. In late September, we would get at least one day of hard frost or one night. And that would kill off a lot of the hornets, yellow jackets, and wasps. The last 4 years, at least, we have not had a hard frost until late November or even early December. I think this year, I would say we did not have a hard frost until early December. So that means that the yellow jacket, hornet, and wasp populations have continued to search for food, plus any eggs that had been laid, a lot of them are being born early. And when they come out looking for food and they don't find any pollen or nectar out there, they are considered meat eaters and they will go after the honeybees and other native bees and decimate them. Now, we had a pollinator festival out at the farm a number of years ago in early fall. And we went to do a hive opening with a lot of people around us. And when we opened the hive, which had been one of our stronger beehives, it was full of yellow jackets. The numbers in the hive will decrease as you go into fall, and then they build up again over the winter. When there are not as large number of bees in your hive, they're not as able to fight off an attack by yellow jackets or hornets or wasps. And when I opened the hive up, it was totally decimated by the yellow jackets. They had wiped out all the bees and were eating up all of the stored honey. So it basically has forced us to start using yellow jacket and wasp traps at that time of year to prevent that from happening. So that's a direct impact of climate change on us. The other things that are affecting us is because of climate changes, we're losing habitat. The temperature shifts are really terrible. The up and down really confuses the bees. and it's increasing the number of diseases that are caused by some of the problems that bees have. This is just a report that was done in England that talked about the impact of the climate change. And these are just some bees on a flower grabbing up the pollen and nectar. Nectar becomes the bees, is turned into honey and becomes the bees' carbohydrate source, and the pollen again turns into bee bread, and that's their protein source. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about the impact that the beekeeping program has had on the farm. That's just the bee collecting again nectar and pollen. So one of the premises for our study on the farm to show how the beekeeping program has an increased output is that we also wanted to make sure that we understood that when you analyze the impact of the program, you have to take into consideration all the other factors that affect the farm's success or failure year to year. Temperature, weather, rain, lack of rain. We've taken all of those things into consideration when we compare our year to year. There's a bee with that yellow pellet on the back of its leg as pollen that is pushed together that it will then take to the hive. This happens to be a sunflower that it's looking at. So at Drumlin, they do not have an irrigation program. They basically depend totally on rain, sufficient rain for watering. And they do have a vehicle that has two huge drums that they keep water in that they will use to water some of the more sensitive plants in times of drought. A couple of years ago when we had that major drought in New England, if people remember, the worst drought that we've had in recorded history, they had volunteers out there doing bucket brigades to feed some of the more sensitive plants. They do not use non-organic means for pest control or fertilizing at the farm. And in the past, the pollination, besides the wild pollinators that might be out there, was dependent upon two hives at the farm were out there and native pollinators. So over the last 6 years, we've been following the production on the farm and taking into consideration all of the other things that have happened. And we have found that the output on the farm has increased approximately 20% from what it had been. The quality of a number of the different crops has drastically increased. And the one I use as an example is squash. Prior to the program, squash were smaller. When they're really being properly pollinated, squash tend to grow much larger and healthier. We also have the additional profit center that's been created by having the honey production on the farm that Mass Audubon will sell. And again, it's increased production, our output, by 20%. And so that's one of the reasons why we totally recommend small scale or organic farms, or people even in their backyards create and start doing beekeeping to help increase their output and in effect give them an additional profit center of having the honey to sell. So this is a little primer on how to do it and what it costs and what projected output would be dollar-wise. These are just pictures of Drumlin, the farm at different stages. This is corn. So a goal of any beekeeping program is to increase the pollination success of the crops and increasing the outnumbers for the farm, thereby increasing the income and profit margins for the farm. We also want to create an additional profit center for the farm through the sale of honey and other products of the hive. And we want to increase the population of native bees and other pollinators at the farm and the overall environment, which will benefit the production on the farm as well as help pollinate the surrounding communities. The example I use is when I had bees at my house in Cambridge. I had a neighbor who had a plum tree that he would never get any plums from. Once I started keeping bees and they pollinated his tree, he didn't know what to do with all the plums. So that's a quick example of how pollinating increases and what the effects it will be. And here are one of the girls. I think most people know that majority of the honeybees in a hive are female. It's a female-run society. They make all the decisions, but they do all the work. We also want to increase the encouragement of increasing native bees and their population. And there's a continual demand, as everybody knows, for organic and sustainably grown food. I think that business, in effect, has exploded in the last 10 years. And that starting these programs will help increase that production and attract more of the buying public, hopefully. Just some decorations on a standard Langstroth hive, which are the boxes you see. So setup expenses. Now again, there's another bee on a different flower, and you can see how it's covered in pollen. And again, another view of the farm with different crops. In the background, you can see that's one of the roving chicken houses that they have. They move their chickens around the farm with an electric fence to keep them in, but it serves two purposes. One, it helps to fertilize the ground with the chicken poop, and it also helps to percolate the ground because of the chickens pecking into the ground. And they move those around all season long, as they do with the sheep and the goats. So here are some cost analysis. So this is a different type of hive. As I said earlier, at Drumlin, we tend to do a lot of the different types of hives. This is called a wari hive. It's a more natural approach to beekeeping. I don't know if there are pictures of the windows, but the other side, there are windows that open up that you can look into. I do a number of these at some schools in the area, and the kids can open the window and see what the bees are doing. And this kind of replicates what bees do in the wild, where there are no frames, they're just a bar, and the bees will attach their honeycomb to it. It's just a much more natural approach, and it replicates what they do in the trees. That's a Langstroth, the typical one that most people use. So this analysis covers a number of different setups, and the projections are given for 1, 3, or 5 beehives. Prices are based on a company called Better Bee Company in New York State, but I'm not including shipping costs because that obviously is based on where you're located. And I do not include labor costs for implementing this program. One person could implement any of the 3 options. I basically run 18 hives out at the farm, and I'm in effect doing it by myself, except for 1 or 2 interns that at times will help. And the amount of time required increases different times a year and decreases at other times of the year. These are 2 Langstroth hives. They happen to be experimental hives where we're trying different natural techniques. We don't use any chemicals in our hives for dealing with problems. We have been developing and testing some natural approaches to beekeeping and dealing with the problems that bees have. So this chart, and in the handouts that I sent in, it includes these charts so that you can see the types of costs involved and how much things will cost. And I show the setups for either 1, 3, or 5 hives. And it really depends on how big of a farm you have, how many hives you do. Even 1 hive will be beneficial. And if people want to put them in their backyard, this just shows the cost for the different items. It does assume Langstroth hives. And again, there are different approaches and different types of equipment that the costs vary differently, but not that much. So the bottom line here is that, and it also covers capturing your honey, the equipment you need, bottling supplies, and labeling, which is based on what it costs us out at the farm to do ours. And we use custom printed labels. And it just shows what it would cost to run that. So your total expenses are at the bottom for, again, 1, 3, and 5 hives. There's a closer view of the roving chicken houses, which I get a kick out of. So here are some gross projections for income. And these are based on net honey produced. Okay, this is after what we leave in the hives for the bees to overwinter and for them to eat. Honeybees are the only insect that provide us food. As some of the kids say to me, you steal their food. Well, in effect, they make a surplus. It's not like when they get to 80 pounds, they stop. They just continue bringing in honey. And so we are able to capture the difference. We're selling bottles at $10 per 8-ounce bottle. Though at this point now at Drumlin, they're selling it at $12 a bottle. And this is based on a survey of a number of different places where raw honey is sold: farmers markets, farm stands, specialty stores, local supermarkets. So that's kind of the average price. So gross amounts, if you were to capture 100 pounds, it shows how much that would generate for 1 hive, 3 hives, or 5 hives, and all the way up to 180 pounds. The most I have ever taken off a hive in a good year is 150 pounds per hive. Though I know people who pull 180 or more. It totally depends on what kind of a season is and where your hives are and what's available for the bees. This is just more views of the farm at different stages. Honey sales could be done a number of different ways. Farmers markets, local farm stand in front of, near your farm. You can sell locally to restaurants. A lot of the smaller restaurants love locally sourced foods, including honey. Drumlin at times will include it with the CSA shares, and you can sell to specialty stores. When I was keeping bees in Cambridge, there was a small specialty honey store, and she used to buy she always wanted local honey. Over time, besides the honey, there are other products that can become available out of the hives. Beeswax, which can be used for making candles, lip gloss, polish, soap. And you can also get what they call propolis, which is a resin the bees collect from the trees and they use in the hive to seal cracks. It also has antibiotic properties. And some people will collect royal jelly, which is a hormonal substance the bees produce that has certain beneficial effects on for people. We don't happen to collect royal jelly because it's a hard process. And if you ever try to buy it in a store, you would see how expensive it is. We use a lot of the wax to make candles and ornaments that we do with the kids in our programs. But you could use for selling, for making more profit. This is just a picture of bees in a hive. It was taken through one of the hives that I had shown you, the Wari hive, that has windows so the kids can see what's actually happening inside the hive. This is another particular type of hive. It's basically from Slovenia. And 1 in 3 families in Slovenia are beekeepers. And it's just, I call it the lazy man's approach to beekeeping because there are no boxes to pick up. There's a door in the back that opens up, kind of looks, the yellow is the hive itself. The other part is a structure we had built. And it looks like a kitchen cabinet. So these are some assumptions with respect to the income and expense projections. After your first year, there aren't really any major capital expenses that have to be made. For this analysis, I have assumed that you would have to replace your bees every year. That is not the case. On average at Drumlin over the 6 years, we've only had to replace 20% of our bees, meaning we've only lost 20% of the bees in the hives for a number of different reasons. I carry equipment repair or replacement at a 10% annually. And again, that varies based on weather conditions and the impact on the equipment. Bottles and labeling expenses are carried annually. And then some feeding supplies or treatment supplies are carried annually. And I've made no projected increases for the sale of the honey, which can happen. And at Drumlin, they now sell them at $12 a bottle, and they can't keep the honey on the shelves. And I think that's partially because, one, there's a greater demand for raw honey. It's not, again, raw honey is non-pasteurized. The problem with pasteurized honey is when you pasteurize it and heat it above 145 or 50 degrees, it kills all the good properties of honey. And then it's just really sugar. So we sell our honey without it being heated. Most farmers markets are selling raw honey. Organic honey is another type that comes out of farms or bee apiaries that are certified organic. We can't certify ours as organic because I'm not sure where my bees are going all the time. Though there's so much land and food sources at Drumlin, we don't think our bees are leaving the property. Bees will go up to 5 miles away to collect if they need to, but they're smart enough to know not to go that far if it's right in front of their nose, in effect. Okay, so this looks at what the total annual expenses to run a program would be for, again, 1 hive, 3 hives, or 5 hives. And as you can see, I'm just running the numbers based on what bee packages would cost, though that at this point, they're a little higher than 125. When I first started, they were $75 a package. They're now about 150. So as the number of bees have decreased, obviously the costs have gone up, and what the other expenses would be. And here are projections of what net annual profit would be. So this is for one hive. So obviously year one at 100 gallons, you're not really going to make a lot because your expenses were higher. But when you get to year two and year three and beyond, you increase your income. So at 100 gallons of honey in year two, you would be walking away with net profit of almost $1,400. And that would go up based on the amount of honey you collect. Okay. So this is based on 3 hives. In year two, again, you're looking at almost $4,600. So your amounts will increase over time. This happens to be a feral hive. One of our hives did what we call absconded. It wasn't happy where the location of the hive was. And it was so hot, it went into a hollow tree, which is what feral bees will do in the wild. But it was so hot, they started building their hive, their comb, on the outside of the tree, as you can see in this picture. That never usually happens in New England or even in this country. It's usually in parts of Africa or South America where it's really hot. Bees will do this all the time. So this was kind of an interesting attraction for everybody out at the farm. Unfortunately, when the winter came, it basically disappeared. So this is the net profit for 5 hives. And again, at year two, you're talking about it just on 100 gallons per hive. You're talking about net profit of almost $7,300. And, you know, for a small scale farmer, that's a considerable amount of money. So again, that's why we've encouraged small scale farmers to start beekeeping programs. One, to increase their production on the farm itself, and also to create this additional profit center. Anybody that wants to start a beekeeping program or start beekeeping, we suggest that you take a beekeeping or go to bee school. Most counties in the Northeast and have beekeeping associations who run bee schools. They generally run in the winter and early spring. Around here, most of the bee schools are run from the end of February through March or early April. And it's usually one night a week for a couple of hours. And what's good about it is there are a lot of members of the clubs who will mentor people once they go to get started. We run a bee school at Drumlin that's 5 weeks. Plus we'll do an additional field class out in the fields, run Tuesday nights for 2 hours. And by the end, people are able to keep bees, and we will also mentor people. There's a frame full of honey that we're getting ready to capture and extract. The cappings, as you can see, are kind of creamy or white and flat. One of the things you learn about is how to tell what is in the frame itself. And this list is included in your handouts. It's just the websites for all of the different county clubs in Massachusetts, including our Drumlin Farm Bee School. And people are basically signing up now for our school starts the first Tuesday in March. I don't know the dates of the other ones, but most of them are around the same time. And this is just more frames full of honey. So that's about 20 pounds of honey in each frame. So what will happen, to summarize here, what will happen if climate change, if we don't get climate change under control? our farms are going to die slowly but surely. Now, this happens to be decorations that Mass Audubon puts up around Halloween when they do an event out in the fields, but it kind of gets the point across. So we really need to wake up and do something before it's too late. We can plant a lot more variety of plants that will bloom throughout the season. Planting in clumps help the pollinators find the plants. NOFA has a pollinator network program that they're developing and working on. If people are interested, I think you can go on the website and find out more information. We're looking at, or people are looking at, creating networks or pathways of pollinator-friendly plants so that the pollinators can kind of move through the environment. You want to choose plants that are native to the region and that are adapted to our local climate. You want to eliminate pesticide use. And if you need to use one, you want to find organic treatments that will not harm the pollinators. It's interesting, most other countries have banned some of these negative pesticides and insecticides, and we still are fighting to do that here. So hopefully that'll change. If you apply stuff, we suggest you do it at night when most pollinators are not flying. When in Massachusetts, they will do mosquito spraying. It's gotten a little easier to regulate how that is done. Used to be, if you did not want your property sprayed, you had to file with your local board of health by a certain date with a certified letter. Now there's a website through MDAR, which is Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, where you can submit a form online to stop them from spraying on your property. You can also get emails about when they're planning to spray, so that if you are keeping bees, there are some things you can do to help protect your bees from the spraying. Since most spraying is done early evening or at night when the bees are in, just covering your hives with a wet sheet will help prevent the bees from getting infected by that insecticide. And the shelf life, in effect, of once it's sprayed is relatively short, so that you don't have to worry about the bees getting affected by it. You want to create native bee habitats. Everybody cleans up their yards in the fall and pulls all their leaves in. And we suggest that you leave piles of leaves in different parts of your yard, because a lot of the native bees will nest in those areas and lay their eggs for the next season. Again, a bee with a pollen pellet on it, and it's collected, and you can see all the pollen on the bee. You want to find regional wildflower mixes, and the Exorcist Society, if anybody doesn't know, really produces a lot of regional wildflower mixes that you can buy. And a lot of bee company suppliers carry it, and some of the even landscape stores carry it. I recommend people remove their grass lawn areas and replace with wildflower gardens or other ground covers like clover that don't require the level of water or fertilizer or care that grass requires. And, you know, as in parts of the country, it's already a major problem. One of our next major issues in this country is going to be the scarcity of water. And so we're getting away from these plants and lawns that need so much water will have a positive impact on our environment. And you need to educate your neighbors about providing for the pollinators, as I talked about, leaves and things. And we need to start raising up our voices. back in my day when I was young, our generation kind of really pushed against the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And it forced major changes. The youth today around the world are raising their voices up about what our generation has done to the climate and to the environment. And we need to really support them and help. Drumlin or Mass Audubon runs a whole climate justice program for teens and high school kids. And they're out there really pushing. This is just some of the information I believe is in the handout in this area. And more people need to get involved. We just need to give our bees a chance. And anybody that has any questions or wants further information in the future, this is my contact information, my cell phone, and my email address. Okay, so that is it, and I will shut that off. And I'm glad to answer any questions that might be there.
Thanks, Mel. That was a great talk. If anyone has any questions, feel free to come off mute to ask them, or you're welcome to just drop them in the chat and I can read them.
I have a question, Mel, about some of these other hive types you've been using at the Drumlin Farm, and if you could speak to what you've learned about better disease resistance or resiliency, pros and cons of some of those different hive types.
Well, again, as I said, we do Langstroths, which take a lot more work by the beekeeper, which I'm not anti to. But the Wari hive, the one I showed the picture of, was developed by a guy named Abbé Ware in France years ago. And it's just the bar in each box. The boxes are a little smaller. It doesn't produce as much honey as the Langstroth hive, but some of us are not in it just for the honey. It's really more about making sure there are enough bees out there for pollinating. It replicates what the bees would do in the wild, where they would find a hole in a hollow tree, and they would start at the top where they go in and they would start building down. And it's the same thing in the Wari hives. They start in the first box. With Langstroth hives, you add boxes from the top. So every time you open the hive, you are releasing the heat sink that the bees have created. Now, in the middle of the summer, when it's 100 degrees out, that's not as big an issue. But in the spring, the queen needs 90-degree plus temperatures for her to be able to lay her eggs and for them to develop. So every time you open that hive to add a box, the heat dissipates. And so the bees have to, again, work hard to generate that temperature again. With the Wari hive, when you add a box, you're adding it from the bottom. So you're never really opening up that and breaking that heat sink. So that's one advantage from my viewpoint. The bees are always generating their own beeswax. Most Langstroth hive beekeepers, they're using frames with what we call foundation, which is a sheet of beeswax that someone has collected and run through a press that imprints the hexagon shape. And then the bees build it out. When they have analyzed that beeswax, because it comes from all over the country, it's full of chemicals and pesticides. So that when the bees build out their own comb in the Wari hive, there is the amount of chemicals is drastically lower because they're only putting in any chemicals that they might have picked up when they're out foraging. So it's healthier. They also are building smaller cell honeycomb, which tends to be less attractive to the biggest insect problem that bees have are called mites. And mites are kind of like deer ticks. They carry a lot of diseases. So when they attach themselves to the bee, they're attaching them to suck off their fat. But they will then inject viruses into the bees, which then weaken them. Well, with the smaller cell size that the honeybees build in the what I call natural hive, they're not, the mites aren't attracted to those as much. Plus, you're constantly replacing that beeswax. Now, on some of our Langstroths at Drumlin, based on what we've learned from the Wari hives, is we basically have put frames without any foundation in them, and the bees are building them out also, which again is a little healthier. But I also like the windows on the Wari hives because we can open them and see what's going on. So I don't have to go into that hive as often. We also use what we call horizontal hives. We have one called the Valkyrie, which is a horizontal box, which again, I use frames without beeswax in them. But especially if you have kids, I recommend Wari hives because the windows are great because the kids can see what's going on. And I think the bees end up being healthier with those. So I hope that helps. And you can, I think in the biography I included, there is a free download of a book written by Avi Ware called Beekeeping for All, and it goes through his whole process, and it even includes plans for building a Wari hive. Okay. Anybody else? Yep.
Yeah, Mel, let's see, am I on? You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. My name's Tony Lee, and I work with a group called Can We Stop Climate Change? Educational, stopping climate change. And I've often felt that bees are like canaries in a mine.
True.
That if you pay attention to the canaries, or if you are in the mine, you better pay attention to the canaries because they're going to tell you something that will save your life. So there's a metaphor for that for bees. And I've often felt that we will save that which we love. And so to build a case for the love of bees will help save climate change if people follow it. So I'm curious about if there are any videos that really are about a love affair with bees, or articles that are about that same subject. You know, the monetary, you know, people they'll take that on if they have the passion. So just staying right with the passion of bees, what would you recommend that we communicate?
So there's a great video done by the guy from Burt's Bees, who unfortunately has passed away. But he did a series of videos with, what's her name? Rosalina, I can't remember her last name. But it's very well done, and it talks about bees and why we need them and how to help. If you email me, I will send it to you.
Okay.
And I believe my email is in the handout, though it's Mel Beekeeper 24.
Right, I got that in the chat right here. Mel Beekeeper24@gmail.com.
Right. If you email and say, could you send me those videos from
Yep.
that you talked about, I'll send them to you.
Okay, thank
I'll
you.
also send you a couple of other, well, I think in the handouts, there's a bibliography that has some references to articles that help.
So how do we get handouts since we're not in person Maybe
They're digitally, maybe Chris can talk about that. There's a site related to the program that has all the handouts that you can download. Oh, I think she just posted it in the chat.
Yes, so there's a workshop materials folder, and if you click on that link, then you'll see all the folders for the different workshops during the winter conference that have materials and handouts. And if you look for Mel's, it's the fourth one down with his last name Gadd. He has all the materials in that folder, the subfolder there.
Thank you
And
very
Mel,
much.
yes, and Mel, if you'd be willing to share those links with me as well, I can put those into the workshop materials folders so that way everyone else on the workshop can see those as well.
Okay.
And we have a couple questions in the chat. Sarah was asking, what do you use to treat your bees for varroa mites? Do you have an opinion about oxalic acid?
So the problem with oxalic acid is the major protocol that people are using now is they are doing a vaporized form of oxalic acid. They have a metal plate that's tied to a battery that they'll pour the powdered oxalic acid on and shove it into the hive and then plug it in and it vaporizes. Vaporized oxalic acid is very dangerous stuff. You need to use a heavy duty respirator if you do it. I'm too much of a klutz and I don't think you get full coverage. I actually use rhubarb leaves. Rhubarb leaves have 5 to 10% oxalic acid in them. And rhubarb leaves, when they harvest rhubarb, the leaves are cut off and generally thrown away. If you go to farm stands or farmers market, generally they have the leaves there and you ask them, they'll just give them to you. I take the whole leaf and I throw it on top of the frames inside the hive, and the bees chew through it. Bees are very sanitary. They will remove any debris from their hive. They will chew through those leaves, releasing the oxalic acid, which knocks the mites down. So that, I do that approach, and I do it, I'm forgetting the word right now, but I do it on a regular basis. I don't wait until I have a problem. At times, maybe once a month, if I go into the hives, I will throw a rhubarb leaf on top of the frames. I also treat my bees, I feed my bees with a mushroom tea. There is a guy named Paul Stamets who is, I call him the godfather of mushrooms in this country. And he went in his backyard. Actually, the picture at the end of the talk that showed Save the Bees with bees in a yard is actually from him. He went in his backyard one day and realized that fungus and mushrooms that had water sitting on them in his yard, the bees were all over it, sucking it up. And he, jointly with an entomologist at Washington State U, started studying what the impact of this mushroom mixture or tea was on the bees. And basically, they started feeding bees different combinations of these mushrooms brewed into a tea. And I read an article about it in a research study. So I had 2 test hives that I started feeding my bees. Normally when you start a beehive in the spring, you start feeding them. Now, a lot of people will feed them with sugar water. I tend not to use sugar water. I use honey water from honey I've captured from the hives, but I also started mixing in this tea mixture. And then I had my bees, a number of the bees analyzed later on in the season in a lab at Harvard that I had helped with some research they were doing, and found out that this tea mixture was decreasing the viral loads in the bees almost down to 0. And the viral loads would be increased by the mites sucking on their fat and injecting them with these viruses. And also the level of mites in the hives dissipated based on using this approach. So I now treat all our hives out at the farm with both the rhubarb leaves and the mushroom tea, and I've had a fairly high level of success. I have not lost a hive to mites in the last 2 years since I've been doing this. So I hope that helped.
Thank you.
And again, if you email me, I can send you a write-up that we did with recipes for the mushroom tea and the rhubarb approach.
And Mel, we have one additional question in the chat that I think have a little bit of time to get to before we have to wrap it up. Don is asking, are bee hotels a good way to support native bee populations, or are they problematic?
No, they're great. Anything you can do to encourage native bees is great. I got it started in beekeeping by taking blocks of wood, drilling holes the size of drinking straws, and sending away for what they call mason bees. They would send you a number of straws filled with mason bee eggs, and they would start coming out in the spring. And then they would lay their eggs in this block of wood with the holes that I just had sitting on, I kind of hung it on the side of the house in the sun. Leaving leaves down help because they have a place to lay their eggs. Bumblebees, which are native to this country, will lay their eggs in holes in the ground. They'll go into old ant holes or other holes that they might find. So anything that can encourage them helps. Okay. Anybody else? People should feel free to email me if any questions come up. And I usually, within a day or so, will respond. Anybody that's interested in the Drumlin Bee School, in the handouts is a flyer that talks about it in more detail and how you can sign up. So again, most people I think are from all over the state. Every county generally has a beekeeping club that runs a bee school.
It looks
I
like
have one last, I have a question. So for those of us who live in densely packed suburban areas, if we are, for example, I have a large side garden where I do vegetables and a mixture of native and non-native ornamental plants. And someone had approached me about, oh, could I put some beehives in your yard? And I was really concerned about that because I know that some of my neighbors adjacent have pesticide application services. So how much of an issue is that for honey that's produced in an area where there is pesticide application?
It's not an issue for the honey, it's an issue for the bee survival.
Mm-hmm.
And because you can't control where your bees are going unless you have a net hanging over your whole property, it is problematic. So it's a matter of kind of educating your neighbors about switching to more organic pesticides or insecticides or fertilizers, and explaining to them what the negative impact is on the pollinators and that how much better their gardens would do if they didn't use those chemicals.
I would top it off. Why don't you offer them a jar of honey at the end of the season, and that would get them buying into the program.
Well, that's so interesting. So the pesticide doesn't actually end up as a residue in the honey.
Well, it might, but it's not going to be that. It's not going to be at a level that is dangerous to you. Okay, it's more the impact just think about the size of the bee. It's more the impact on the biology of the bee and how it weakens their stamina and ability to survive.
And one more question, if I could. What are your thoughts about the impacts on bees that are trucked around the country, you know, for example, to the giant almond orchards in California? And
well, most commercial beekeepers, that's what they do. They move their bees around the country. It's problematic. I mean, and colony collapse, which everybody has heard about, really affected the commercial beekeepers much more than hobbyist, what I consider myself a hobbyist beekeeper or backyard beekeeper. Because one, they take them out into the almond fields, and which is the major first place that the commercial beekeepers take their bees. And we're talking about thousands of hives that are put into the almond fields. It's, you know, it's problematic because one, at times, the farmers have sprayed their trees before the bees have been removed, which affect and kill off the bees. And two, it's like if I said to you, all you could eat every day, every meal was popcorn, okay? There's no diversity in their food source. Even though they'll move them to another crop, there's still one, you know, it's affecting the kind of mental ability of the bees. And two, they're bringing in a lot, because a lot of these monocrop farmers are using a lot of chemicals, so they're sucking in a lot of the chemicals. And one of the studies about climate change, I mean, a colony collapse, really showed that the bees basically ended up with dementia from all the chemicals, and they would fly off and they couldn't find their way back to their hives. And these commercial beekeepers would come to their hives, to their bee yards, and no one would be there. So something has to change. It would be much better, one, if the almond crops didn't use the chemicals, or if they did it afterwards, or if they had their own bees.
Well, I'm sorry to cut this short because this is such a great discussion, but I did want to interrupt you and let you know that we're coming up on time and we'll need to end it at this point. So thank you so much for this lovely workshop and presentation. I think that we all benefited greatly from it. We've really appreciated the wealth of information. I have a few announcements before we wrap up, and we'll be dropping links into the chat. So please be sure to take a look at these before the Zoom closes. The first is an evaluation. It's a great time to give us feedback on this session. Here's a link to online evaluation, and if you can't get to it now, please try to do it the sooner the better. Secondly, we have our vendor marketplace. Please visit our vendor marketplace to find generous discount codes and valuable information from our vendors. We have an auction going on with some incredible items to bid on. Please visit the website or text NOFA to 855-202-2100 to see the lineup. The items include access to the Soil Food Web School's Foundation courses, a pallet of organic soil delivered from coast of Maine, seed company gift cards, oysters, cheese, books, and so much more. The auction proceeds support our year-round programming and advocacy work. So if you're able, please bid generously. Fourth, if there's anyone here for continuing ed, each session at the NOFA Winter Conference fulfills 1.5 continuing education credits for accredited organic land care professionals. Please keep a record of your attendance to submit to NOFA by January 1st, 2023. Finally, other sessions. We have the conference running from 9 to 5:30 Saturday and 11 to 5:30 on Sunday. All sessions are listed in the program book. Recordings of sessions will be available to attendees on our YouTube playlist by Monday, January 24th. You can find all our presenters' contact information in the program book. Please make sure to grab those links. And again, thank you, Mel, for all of you for attending this workshop.
Thanks everybody for coming. And thanks, Christine, for all your help.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.